All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Amalia Weber. I'm the program specialist here at Rochester Hills Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's Smart Towns program, Pearl Harbor Revisited. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details. Firstly, tonight's program will be recorded and available to view about 1 week from tonight on our YouTube page and on the RHPL website shortly after. We ask the audience members please silence or turn off their cell phones before we begin in order to avoid any disturbances during the presentation. Our next program is an afternoon with the Rochester Poets Society, which will be an in-person event on Sunday, December 10th at 2 p.m. You can sign up for that at calendar.rhpl.org. And now, without further ado, please welcome our presenter, Frank Cardeman.
Thank you, Amalia. I'm glad we're here. Can you hear me okay? It's okay? Okay, good. I'm glad to be here with you tonight. Before I get started, I always like to introduce myself. Is one, two. Is that better? Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. I'll just get a little closer. Yeah, okay. I'd like to get a few things cleared up before I get started. First of all, I've never been in the military, but I've been a military historian for over 60 years. And I come to you tonight to revisit what happened 82 years ago. But in addition to those 82 years ago tonight, I'm going to take you through 6 months afterwards through the Battle of Midway, to share with you how America responded and how we were able, by the time we got to Midway, we destroyed the Japanese Navy. So I'm here tonight to say thank you. Say thank you for all those who served. And at this time, I'd like to ask all of those who have served to please stand. Would you please? Round of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much. I doubt that anybody was at Pearl at this point. Is that correct? There's only a few left, I'm afraid. So my story tonight is about what really happened, how did it happen, and what was going on in the background that we got attacked so surprisingly, so unaware, so caught with our pants down. And America suffered one of its greatest military defeats at Pearl. But the story tonight is also, and more importantly, about how America responded with its bravery, with its ingenuity, with its creativity, to come back within 6 months. So let me get started. Eventually, I'm going to get to this chair. I got bad knees. I've been with a crutch here for about 6 months. And as soon as that goes, I need the chair. I prefer standing, though. Okay. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, 81 years ago today. The U.S. entered the World War II a little bit beforehand. Now, we weren't directly involved, but September 1 of 1939, Germany invaded Poland. And from that point in time to December 7, you had 2 years and 3 months. And during that period of time, our president, President Roosevelt, was very much committed to trying to help Great Britain. Couldn't do it directly or he would have been impeached. But he did it with the Lend-Lease program that you've all heard of. And more importantly, was able to get the defense industry in America geared up, okay? Feeling that at some point in time, we were gonna have to get into the war. So, what was the U.S. doing before December 7? Well, we were trying to help Great Britain. The prelude to the war in the Pacific. You got to go back a few years. In fact, you got to go back to around 1931, really, when the Chinese were involved with the Civil War in China. But for this purpose, we're going to stay right with 1937 at the Second Sino-Japanese War. And you see the rape of Nanking. Many of you have probably heard of this before. In a moment, I'll share with you what happened. In 1940, Japan invades French Indochina. 1940, the U.S. establishes an embargo on olive oil exports to Japan. Japan wanted to expand its resources, its land. As an island nation, it had to import almost all of its goods, particularly oil, fruits, vegetables. It's a very small piece of land that they have, and they have a lot of people, but as an island nation, they don't have the resources to do it, so they were feeling like they needed to expand. And they had a number of warlords who convinced Hirohito that they should try this. One of the big things that they needed when they were considering war was they needed a great deal of oil to keep the machines running and so forth. So they went to the Dutch East Indies, and they began the process of trying to gather that raw material they were going to need for war. They wanted to take over the Philippines. And I'll show you a map in a little bit why that was important. But they didn't do it because it was an American protectorate, which meant that if they had done so, America would have responded right then and there. So they were very cautious about that. What you'll find out is they invaded Pearl Harbor on December 7. They invaded the Philippines on December 8th. Japan and U.S. are negotiating to avoid war. The U.S. told the Japanese, what you're doing over there is wrong, and we want you to stop killing the Chinese. We want you to stop expanding your horizons. We want you to stop taking the oil fields from East Asia or East Indies, and we want you to stop. And they said no. Then there was negotiations, and what happened was, the same time this was going on for negotiations, there was this military planning that took place in Japan to bomb Pearl Harbor. 1941, early Japanese planning, December 7, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl. 1941, December 8th, Japan invades the Philippines. That was the sequence of events. When Japan invaded China, the rape of Nanking meant that 150,000 male war prisoners were massacred, additional 50,000 male civilians, and raped at least 20,000 women and girls of all ages, many of whom were mutilated and killed in the process. They were just left on the streets. To this day, the Chinese have a bad feeling for the Japanese as a result of this. 1938, there were 1 million Japanese troops in China. It increased, but the Japanese made it clear that their whole role of this 3-all campaign was kill all, burn all, destroy all. That was their attitude at that point. It was a very militaristic attitude. They wanted to expand. They wanted additional property. In 1945, 4 million Chinese people had died, 60 million had been displaced. Many Chinese cities lay in ruins because of the Japanese. So here's a guy by the name of Hideki Tojo. He was in charge of war, and he was one of those war leaders. He felt like Japan needed to more territory and more resources, and was very much belligerent, very much willing to fight. By the way, he committed suicide and was also condemned at the war trials after the war as a war criminal. So here's something I want to show you. In 1941, before the bombing of Pearl, this is what Japan had. Here's the island. This is all of China through here. okay? All of China. That's Formosa, or Taiwan. Here's Hong Kong, and here's French Indochina, which they took the oil from. So at that point, you would say on a map, or from a map, the best thing to do next would be take the Philippines. If you want to control this area of the world, taking the Philippines would be the next step, which is what, of course, they did on December 8th, and got MacArthur out of the Philippines and sent him to Australia. The U.S. demanded that Japan withdraw from China and Indochina. Japan thought that attacking the U.S. would provide them an easy win, a territory, abundant land, resources to rule once they were victorious. The U.S. oil embargo against Japan was hurting Japan's economy. It was really squeezing them down. Japan and the U.S. negotiators tried to avoid war. Now, I suspect many of you have seen videos and information and public documents that showed where the two Japanese negotiators were in the Secretary of State's office, and they were trying like hell to translate some documents that came across Japan. They didn't have any typists, so they were trying to translate it and type it at the same time. Before they got it finished, Pearl Harbor was attacked. And that was a cultural no-no for the Japanese. And we'll share about that in a little bit. Yes?
This oil embargo?
Yeah.
Is that U.S. exports only?
That was the U.S. oil embargo against Japan. Yeah, we were not going to ship Japan any more oil.
Didn't they have other resources to
They did, but this was just our attempt to get them to stop, because now they would have to go fight in other lands to try and get it, which they did, by the way. Here is a map of the Pacific Ocean, the largest ocean in the world. And if you look at the curvature of this was all controlled by Japanese at the time, 1942, 1941. Here is Pearl Harbor. Here is Midway. Distance between those two is 1,300 miles. The distance between the United States and Japan is 7,000 plus miles. And in between the U.S. and Japan, there's nothing in there except Pearl Harbor. So the feeling what the Japanese had was they wanted to get the Philippines. And they felt that it would attract the Americans to come back and fight. So what they believed they had to do was to neutralize the U.S. at Pearl for at least 6 months. And by neutralizing them, what they wanted to do was get them out of the war so they couldn't fight for 6 months. But they didn't think they could ever they didn't believe that they could ever defeat the U.S. What they wanted was a negotiated settlement at Pearl with the U.S., not to fight back, because they wanted the protection and they wanted this entire area. Now, at the same time, you got to remember the other part of World War II was back in Europe. Well, Japan had connected themselves with Italy and with Germany as part of the Axis power. So they also had a lot of confidence with support from Germany, who was having great success at the time, and from Italy. So what's the next step? The next step is on December 7th, at 7:55 in the morning, we were attacked at Pearl. How many of you have been to Pearl Harbor? Yeah, okay. And all of you been out through the memorial and everything, so yeah, okay. It's a unique piece of geography that came out of this island, this harbor, that the U.S. took advantage of by using it as a naval base. Well, when the battle occurred, the Arizona was sunk, West Virginia was sunk, the Oklahoma was sunk, and the California was sunk. Two of them were pulled up and were remaintained and got back into World War II battles. The two that didn't, I believe, was Oklahoma and Arizona. That's what it looked like. You got to understand the two key players for the Japanese. One is a guy named Isoroku Yamamoto, and his lead field commander, if you will, the one who led the charge, he was always in the background, was Nagumo. And they were very, very successful at Pearl, with a few exceptions. Yamamoto, you have to understand, was like the second god of Japan. The first god was Hirohito. And no one had the same stature as Yamamoto. The U.S. commanders at Pearl were guys by the name of Kimmel and Short. Kimmel, in my opinion, from all my reading and my history, was really treated poorly because all of the information coming into the headquarters at Pearl was bloody confusing. They knew that something was going to happen in the Pacific, and there were a lot of, I'll digress a second, but there have been a lot of books and people with beliefs that Roosevelt knew it was going to be Pearl and didn't say anything because he wanted to get into the war. I got to tell you, in all my studies and readings and evaluation, I don't believe that was true. I believe Roosevelt knew that something was going to happen in the Pacific. I don't think he knew it was going to be Pearl Harbor because most people didn't. Most people, it was going to be the Philippine Islands. But he was a leader. And in the military, if you lead something and it fails, you fail too. Short was in charge of the Army and the airplanes. And what did he do? He lined up all of the planes in the middle of the runway. Well, why did he do that? It was a good reason. There were a number of Japanese on the island of Oahu, and there was a great field of sabotage. And so what he wanted to do is to take them from close to the fences and move them as far away as he could to avoid the sabotage, and he lined them up in a row on the runway. Guess what? Made it pretty easy for the Japanese, eh? Both of them were gone immediately. I put a picture of this guy, Joe Roquefort. Now, at this point in time, his efforts were a failure because he didn't get anything or break any codes or know anything about what the Japanese were doing. But he was an unusual duck. He was in intelligence. He was in this basement that was damp and cold, and he only wore slippers and a bathrobe, and he had a crazy personality and everything. But at this point in time, I want you to know that intelligence for the U.S. was a failure. The silence that the Japanese had in getting to Pearl was absolute silence. No one knew where they were. These were the combatants, and you can see that Japan is overwhelming with what they had. This sequencing of 5 attacks came from the Japanese code that was translated by the US Navy. Phase 1, combined torpedo plane and dive bomb attacks lasting from 7:55 to 8:25. Law on the attacks lasting from 8:25 to 8:40. Horizontal bomber attacks 8:40, 9:15. Dive bomber attacks 9:15, 9:45. Warning of attacks and completion of raid after 9:45. There were supposed to be 3 raids. There were only 2. Nagumo refused the 3rd raid, which could have been a major mistake. Here's the sequencing at Pearl. And the dotted lines are dive bombers, the strong lines or the solid lines are torpedo planes. And when the torpedo planes came in, Japan had to create some new technology because for the most part, Pearl Harbor is a very shallow harbor. The only depth that they have is right through the middle, and you have to be perfect, otherwise it's very shallow. And the fear of dropping a bomb into that shallow water was that the bomb would go right to the bottom and stop and just get stuck in the mud. It wouldn't move. So they created wooden, I call it a wooden platform. I don't know how it was designed, but it was almost like 2 little rudders, and it was connected to the bomb, and as soon as it hit, the wood itself would bring the bomb back up to the water, and then it propelled to the ships. So a bit of technology was developed by the Japanese in order to make the damn thing work. This again was a sequence of the ships who were in port and who were sunk or damaged. And rather than get into all of the injuries and all of the bad things that happened, the good thing was there were no aircraft carriers in port. The Japanese thought the aircraft carriers were in port. Some pictures of Pearl. The one down here is of Arizona. There's another picture. 3,000 military were killed within the hour. I believe that two of the mistakes that Japan made was, one, the third raid on Pearl to wipe out the oil fields, and the second one was to leave the oil fields intact. Now, from the Japanese standpoint, there's a strategic reason why they wanted to do that. They believed that they were going to wipe out the entire US Navy and have it incapable of doing anything. And therefore, they would come back. And when they came back, they would have fuel to rule the Pacific Ocean. What they didn't think of was that when the three aircraft carriers came back, if they didn't have these oils and the fields of oil, we couldn't have used any of it for our aircraft carriers. So they left it there, and we were able to use it for our aircraft carriers to take advantage and win the battle at Midway. So a very, very major mistake. Although strategically, when you think about it, from their point of view, if they were able to have taken out the aircraft carriers, they would have been in one hell of a good shape to protect the entire Pacific Ocean to LA for a good number of months, maybe even a couple years, before the US could respond. Here's the Arizona, was hit and sinking. 1,100 men, servicemen, were entombed. And I think most of you have seen that who were out there. It's one of the most poignant moments that I've been to. I've been to Normandy, and I've been to the US Cemetery at Normandy and Omaha Beach. That too was very impressive, but this one here is powerfully impressive. And you know the stories of the men who were at Pearl for the years afterwards, who when they died, they had asked that their bodies be cremated and the ashes be sent back to Pearl, and that they be taken with divers into the Arizona. It became a real calling call. I get goosebumps talking about it. Yamamoto told his war cabinet, I can only guarantee 6 months. Now, why did he say that? Because he was educated at Harvard, because he spoke English, because he worked in the Japanese embassy. He knew America. He knew America's culture. He knew America's production might. He knew America better than any of the other Japanese. And he was convinced that America would respond with vengeance, and that we would only be able to retain it for 6 months because they had the water in between LA and Pearl to protect them for 6 months if they had taken over Pearl. And what I point out in this particular slide is, whoops, I'm sorry. Right here. Yamamoto alone was sunk into an apparent depression because he knew that America would respond. And he knew that he didn't have a shot in hell without getting rid of those 3 aircraft carriers. So he now had to wonder, what is he going to do? And that caused him a great deal of depression. To which he said, and he wrote, I fear all we have done at Pearl is to awaken a sleeping giant. And he was right. December 8th, President Roosevelt goes up to Congress and he speaks and talks about the day of infamy. But here's something you may not know about what happened that day. Most of you know that President Roosevelt was in a wheelchair and from polio, and he was strapped with metal on his legs, and he was always in pain, and he could barely walk. But what he said to his people is, I am going to walk into Congress, I am going to stand tall for my people, I'm going to tell the world we're not bent over, we're going to fight back, and I'm going to do that by walking into Congress. If you've ever seen, I get goosebumps on that one too, because if you've ever seen the military attaché that helped him, you could see him shuffling. He was in such agony. But that great leadership of being out in front of America gathered him enormous response from Americans, because in the next few days, there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans rushing to the military headquarters, whether it was Army, Navy, Marines, whatever it was, to sign up. And there was a large group that were underage that did that. He appointed Nimitz, and he told Nimitz, I'm appointing you to the worst job in the world. You got to go out there and kill the Japanese and win the war, and I don't want you back in the United States until that's over. And Nimitz was out there until 1945. During the next 6 months, Nimitz was in charge of 3 events outside of Pearl Harbor. One was the bombing of Japan. The second was the battle at the Coral Sea. And the last one was the battle at Midway. All he had was 3 aircraft carriers. And after the battle of Midway, he had 2 plus. Roosevelt went to his team and he said to him, this was after Pearl Harbor, he said, we're going to fight back. I want to bomb Japan. And everybody looked at him like he was crazy. How the hell are you going to bomb Japan? We don't have any planes that can travel that far, and they'll never get back. He said, I don't care, just come up with some ideas. Now, this is American ingenuity. Nobody thought that that was possible. So they went to MIT, and they got a guy by the name of Doolittle, who was an aeronautical engineer. And they said to him, we want to bomb Japan. He said, you're all crazy. They said, well, you got to come up with some ideas for us. So he came up with this idea of putting B-25s on an aircraft carrier and having bombers launch from an aircraft carrier to drop some bombs in Japan. Everybody thought he was crazy loco. But what he did was he removed everything in the plane to reduce its weight. Everything. And then there was a chance with the bomb and so forth that it might not work. So when they flew off, he was first, because he said, if it's not going to work, I want to go down first. They didn't know until he launched. But here's the thing. They were supposed to launch within about, this isn't exact, but it's close. They were supposed to launch within 250 to 300 miles away from Japan. Very secretive maneuver. About 450 to 500 miles from Japan, they see some Japanese trawlers, fishermen. The concern then became, will the Japanese trawlers report back to Japan and avoid the chances of us making a sneak attack and killing us before we even get there? So they decided, even with fuel starvation, to get to Tokyo, their game plan was to end up in China. Many of them landed in the water. Many of them landed in Japan, were captured, were tortured, were killed. A few landed in China. Doolittle was one of them. He thought he was a total failure, but he wasn't. They bombed Japan. They bombed a few houses. They bombed a building or two. Militarily, it was insignificant, of course. But to the American people, and more importantly to the Japanese people, who were told by their leaders in the War Council that no American would ever drop a bomb in Japan, it shook the hell out of the Japanese, big time. So there's the B-25 taking off. They had 80 of them, I think, 80 volunteers in 16 different planes. They went off in April 18, off that carrier. I put this picture in here because every year after they came back, they had a reunion. And the reunion had 80 glasses. And those who had perished or died, they flipped over. And those who were there, they would put a drink. They had this bottle of special champagne or something, and they would drink to all the men who weren't there. And as they all left, they all turned over. And on the 2018, the last of the Doolittle Raiders died. So now, what we have is we have something. Pearl was not defeated by the Japanese. Stung, as far as the Americans were concerned, it was a total disaster, and it was, but the 3 aircraft carriers maintained some semblance of a navy for our protection. But then what happened was the Japanese code breakers in Pearl learned that the Japanese, after going through the Philippines, were now going to go down here to the, what is that, the Indies here. Yeah, I can't see it myself here. New Guinea, right. And their intention was to take over 2 new airfields, one in Tulagi and one in Port Moresby. Both of them designed then, in the future, to attack Australia. So their intention was to be in total charge of Asia, okay? That was their intention. So what happened at the Battle of the Coral Sea? Nimitz sends his 2 aircraft carriers down there, and from May 4th to May 8th, you now have the Battle of the Coral Sea. You got December 7, Pearl, you got April, we bombed Japan, you got May now, they're in a major battle of the Coral Sea, and this was the battle that took place with the Yorktown, the Lexington, and an attack group. And this was the breakdown of how it all happened. But here's the thing. This was the first battle fought without any men on the ground. It was the first battle fought with just airplanes and aircraft carriers. And in the end, you would consider it a military draw, but strategically for America, it was a major breakthrough because it was the first time the Japanese were stopped from getting and doing what they wanted to do, and it protected Australia, which then gave a great deal of concern to the Japanese. So in this battle, the USS Yorktown was damaged severely. The Japanese thought that the Yorktown was out of commission. But the Americans got the Yorktown back to Pearl, and the maintenance people said to Nimitz, we got about 4 months to get this thing fixed and back to sea. And Nimitz said so beautifully, you have 72 hours and it better be back at sea. And in 72 hours it was back in sea, ready for Battle of Midway. So who won? As I just said, I think it was a strategic victory, but certainly not a military victory. We lost some planes and we lost some aircraft carriers, and they did the same. But we removed them from taking advantage of that next step. And it becomes important because now the Japanese are in another dilemma. Should they continue south, where they just got hammered a bit at the Battle of Coral Sea, and start moving in on Australia, or should they try and now, once and for all, neutralize the Americans so that they can move south into Australia? So their decision was to attack Midway, 1,300 miles from Oahu, Pearl Harbor, and from there they were going to fly in and send in their troops to Oahu to take over there, because they were convinced they would destroy the American aircraft carriers. What they were most concerned with was not defeating the U.S., but neutralizing them so that the U.S. would go into an exit strategy of negotiated peace for the Japanese to have then control of the entire Pacific in Asia. So, you have these dates. Pearl attack, Nimitz do little raid. In early May, late April, that guy Roquefort and his team broke the JN-25 code, the Japanese code. And he goes to, and then of course in May, Battle of the Coral Sea, and then in June, Battle of Midway. But when he broke the code, he goes to Nimitz and says, "Boss, I think we've broken the code to the point where I believe the Japanese are going to come back and attack Midway." And Nimitz says, "I need more proof than that." So what does he do? Roquefort sends a fake message allowing the Japanese to interpret the message that water distillation plant at Midway is seriously damaged. A few days later, the U.S. interpret a Japanese message that says the U.S. shortly thereafter that AF is short of water. So they were able to immediately tie in where the Japanese were going to attack. And it was Midway. Now here's the other problem that Nimitz had. Admiral King and all the intelligence people back in D.C. did not agree with that. In fact, they were convinced it was going to be a further attack on the Philippines and Australia, and they sent men to Nimitz to try and convince Nimitz not to buy into this cockamamie idea that they were going to move into Midway. And he said, "No, I'm going to put all my marbles on Midway," because he trusted Roquefort so much. So there's Midway, 1,300 miles away. When you look at Midway, it's just a little atoll. It's hardly any land at all. But it was a good position for American defense to see any kind of incoming ships or incoming planes and so forth, so it was a defensive place. Yamamoto's for a Midway attack now. Control of the Pacific, all-out battle with U.S. Success at Midway, America would suffer defeat, seek peace. Complex plan. He had diversionary forces going up to Alaska, going south, going towards Midway, going towards Oahu. He wanted to create a diversionary plan to convince or to get the U.S. confused as to where he was really going to go. But Nimitz knew that it was going to be Midway. So he waited in the east to sabotage the Japanese. So he was going to bring 4 of 8 aircraft carriers to the vicinity of Midway, and they would invade Midway, use the airfields 1,300 miles to Oahu. And once they got to Oahu, they would use the oil for and command the Pacific. The largest battleship in the world, the Yamato, and their smaller ships. But here was the major flaws in the whole argument, right here. They still believed that the battleship was the key naval ship that would be the most important ship in a battle, and that the aircraft carrier was to support it. Whereas in fact, in World War II, with the change of everything, it became the Air Force, the aircraft carrier, and the aircraft became the prominent first-line military defense, with the battleship protecting the Air Force carrier. They underestimated U.S. strength. They thought the Yorktown was destroyed, but it was repaired. And the U.S. code breakers knew exactly when and where they were coming in. Here's another quirk of fate. The key guy for America's naval during World War II was a guy by the name of Bull Halsey. I had that. Okay, Bill, let's just call him Bull. Anyhow, Bull was our most successful military guy in the Navy. He was the Patton of the water. His mentality was to attack, 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 never back away, attack, attack, attack. It almost cost him his job in a future battle over Leyte Gulf, but that's another issue. But anyhow, he comes down with dermatitis. So our lead key warrior on the sea is out of commission. So they have to give it to somebody, and they give it to Spruance. May have been the greatest decision made, because Spruance was over here, Halsey was over here in mentality and attacking. And I'll share that with you in a minute. These are the other two players. Fletcher and Spruance were in the Battle of Midway. In Midway, you had the smaller aircraft carrier, the Mason. You then had the Spruance Enterprise, Yorktown with Fletcher. And these carriers went out to the east of Midway. They stayed far to the east. And you can see the different trajectories where Japan was trying to come in. And of course, down here is, here's Hawaiian Islands over here. Here's Midway right here. So they moved way away from the Japanese, because the Japanese then would have a difficult time with fuel starvation, of even trying to find the Americans. And they had no idea that the Americans were in wait. Here are the forces. You can see the Japanese forces. 4 carriers, we have. This is just a map of kind of the maneuverings of where all the Japanese were and where the Americans were. You can see that the Americans stayed far to the east, and the Japanese were coming from the west to the east. These PBYs were the planes that went out to search, to try and find out where the carriers were, where the ships were. There's some of them who discovered the Japanese ship. It's a U.S. carrier with torpedo aircraft. Here's a statement by Waldron. If there's only one plane to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit, and may God be with us. We lost many, many planes from fuel starvation because we couldn't find them fast enough, and we couldn't fulfill the objective and get back. And in the case of Midway, that's just a picture of it. In the case of Midway, the victory of Midway took place in 5 minutes. You can believe that. It was 5 minutes. You had a guy by the name of McCluskey, and you had a guy by the name of Leslie. McCluskey got his group to go in and wiped out 2 aircraft carriers, the Kaga and Yakagi. Leslie, who came from another ship, came from another direction and met up with him at about the same time, which was accidental. And they destroyed the aircraft carrier, the Soryu. Both of these guys did well with their awards. They become real admirals. But then the Hiryu down here went about finding us. And the Hiryu sunk the Yorktown. Shortly thereafter, the Hiryu sunk itself. So, in this short period of time, in this very short period of time, by the way, a lot of Americans whose fuel a lot of the American flyers whose fuel was empty, dropped into the ocean, they were watching the battle take place. Nagumo. The Akagi was the fleet ship that Nagumo was on. He was that field commander I told you about. He had to leave because that ship was going down. And Yamamoto, who was in the background, decided to take over the battle while he was on the ship, the Yamato. Yamamoto wanted to still fight the fight to get rid of the last 1 or 2 aircraft carriers, and he tried to draw out Spruance towards Alaska. So here's Spruance over here, here's the Yamato over here. He wanted to take them up like this, and he wanted to destroy them before he left. This is where Spruance said, no, we're going to defend, and we're going to turn around and go further east. And at that point in time, Yamamoto said, turn the ships around, let's go home. December 7th to June 42, 6 months, the battle's over. Military losses, the battle, pretty significant. Less so for the U.S. because we ambushed them, okay? We got a little revenge about ambushing, and we got it back of why winning at the Battle of Midway. I believe the oil fields was the biggest mistake that they didn't destroy. Otherwise, the Americans could not have survived. The second thing was they broke the code. And without that code being broken, they would not have known where to place their aircraft carriers to fight the fight. Lastly, you got to give Nimitz a lot of credit for supporting Roquefort, the local security guy who broke the code, rather than taking a pass and going to General Marshall and all of the guys in Washington, D.C. and believing them. The Japanese had what they called victory disease. They had such an easy time at Pearl. They thought they were invincible. They thought they could come back and do the same thing, but they couldn't. The Japanese didn't get their submarines in place fast enough to be able to be and have any part of the battle. And McCluskey's decision to search beyond the rational range of this aircraft and thus finding the IJN carriers with the aircraft all on deck, fully fueled and armed, which was a miracle in itself. McCluskey was Air Force Commander of Enterprise. He lost over half of his aircraft due to fuel starvation. And they went in with very little fuel left to get back to any ships. I also believe Spruance being named also was a rather divine intervention that didn't cause us to have to stay and fight further to maybe lose the battle to the Japanese there. Excuse me. But lastly, I think it was of the bravery of the pilots, the valor, the mental state of mind that they were going to do what they had to do. I think it was just a commitment on the American part that we were not going to allow this to happen. Excuse me. The war in the Pacific was not over after Midway, but in 6 months we went from being devastated to eliminating the Japanese Navy. Excuse me. Better. Many of you know about these different places. Maybe some of you were even there, I don't know. But the last battle was Okinawa. That's the closest island to Japan. Yanks plunge into the final battle for Okinawa. Excuse me. April 1 to June 22, 3 months plus. Battle ended. We lost 12,500 men, 37,500 wounded. A lot of them died. 83,000 casualties. One island, 3 months. Japan lost 77,000. 30,000 Okinawa conscripts were killed. And you can see how many were captured. During this battle, the term kamikaze pilots took place because the Japanese knew they were losing, and they had very few seasoned pilots. So they created this term kamikaze, which most of the pilots were very young, were told to go die for your emperor. And they would try to take their planes into ships or people on the beaches or whatever. That was their whole intent. The Yamato was sunk there by American Air Force. the largest ship that they've had was sunk in Okinawa. The devastation at Okinawa, the amount of killing and dying, the general who was in charge there had an increasingly aggressive plan, and he was very successful at it, but he also committed suicide. Half of the people that were captured, or half of the Japanese that thought they were going to be shot, committed suicide to jump off the cliffs. It was that whole mentality, that whole time frame that caused Truman at the time, who was now our president, to consider what would happen if our next step is to invade Japan. And the military came back and said, we'll probably lose anywhere between 1.5 and 2 million men, because the Japanese mentality was of this code of die or for the country at all costs. And so there was not going to be an easy invasion of Japan. And he chose the decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So in August 6th, in August of 9, the two bombs took place, and theoretically the war ended there, but it really only ended after Hirohito, whose voice had never been heard by the Japanese people. The only people who've heard it was the War Council. But the people in Japan never heard his voice. And he came on radio after Nagasaki and said, "The war is over. Lay down your arms. The war is over." That ended the war for Japan. I think you all know that in September that year, on September 2, in the battleship Missouri, the final declaration of war ended, became VJ Day. This was the during the Pacific Theater, almost 300,000 for Americans. What battle turned the tide of World War II? I think it was Midway. Anybody to the US Memorial down in DC? Yeah. This quote here, I read this to my students all the time because I think it's relevant. It says, they had no right to win, yet they did. And so they changed the course of a war. Even against the greatest odds, there is something in the human spirit, a magical blend of skill, faith, and valor that can lift men from certain defeat to incredible victory. That's what happened at Midway. Incredible valor. And I tell my students that in their careers they're going to get knocked down. You got to get back up. You got to get back up with a passion that you're going to move forward. You're not going to step back, you're going to go forward. And it's that skill and that faith and that courage to do that is what helped win that particular battle. I show this map. If we lost at Midway. And I think it just becomes so bloody clear that there isn't anything in the Pacific Ocean except Hawaiian Islands between the US and Japan. And for the Japanese to have won that battle and won Oahu, that war would have been much, much longer. We got some, how did that happen? We got some revenge on April 18, 1943. You know, we broke that Japanese code. They found out where Yamamoto was going to fly to. And they knew he was going to fly to Bougainville in the Solomon Islands on the morning of April 18. It was a very rare and unusual tactic for the lead military man in Japan to go into the field, but he wanted to encourage them to keep fighting. He wanted to give them a lift, is what he was doing it for. The code breakers who saved Midway now get Yamamoto. We sent out a squadron of P-38s, wiped him out. He crashed in one of the islands, and the report back in Japan was like the second dying of the gods, because there was nobody to take his place. Nobody. The Japanese went back and got his body and brought it back to Japan. but revenge was had on this guy. Events leading up to the battle. I point this out as I started my speech by saying, 82 years ago, we suffered one of the greatest defeats that America has ever experienced in the military. And yet, within 6 months, we were able to drop bombs in Japan, do battle Coral Sea, and win the most important battle of Midway, and eliminate the Japanese Navy. To me, that's the story. That's the story of American bravery, story of American ingenuity, the valor and the commitment to that victory. That's really the story tonight, from Pearl to Midway. It's a sad, but I think positive story is the way it ended. And in the end, we did have VJ Day in September of '45. So thank you all for being here. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.